The most boring cars ever made. The Saturn L series. Now, when you hear the word Saturn, you probably think of the cheap plastic paneled compact from the 90s that your high school chemistry teacher drove. Or maybe you don't think of them at all, which is exactly the problem. Saturn decided they needed a mid-size sedan to compete with the Accord and Camry. So in 2000, they gave us the L series, a car that looked fine. Not good, not bad, just aggressively neutral. It was built on an European Opel platform, but somehow all the charm got sucked out in the process. And then came 2003. This is when Saturn, for some reason, decided that what the L series needed was a facelift, and instead of making the car better, they made it worse. The front grille and became grotesque, with these stretched out, droopy headlights that make it look permanently exhausted. The grille got bigger, but not in a cool, aggressive way, more like a we run out of ideas way. It was the automotive equivalent of a bad nose job. Driving one was just as uninspiring. The base engine was a 2.2-liter four-cylinder making 135 horsepower. There was also a V6 option, but it didn't make the car exciting, just faster at being boring. Saturn was already struggling by the early 2000s, and the L series didn't help. Next up, we have the Chevy HHR, a car that tried to ride a wave that had already crashed. In the early 2000s, Chrysler somehow convinced people that what they really wanted was a retro-styled front-wheel drive hot rod, and thus the PT Cruiser was born. Love it or hate it, the PT Cruiser was a hit for a while, and that success made GM take notice. But instead of striking while the iron was hot, they let it cool completely before launching their own version, the HHR, in 2006, long after the retro craze had faded. The HHR, which stood for Heritage High Roof, was designed by the same guy behind the PT Cruiser, Brian Nesbitt. And to his credit, it did capture a similar vintage paneled wagon look. But by the time it arrived, the world has moved on. People who wanted a PT Cruiser already had one, and those who didn't, well, they weren't suddenly changing their mind for an HHR. The driving experience was about as exciting as waiting in a line at the post office. It had the same 2.2-liter and 2.4-liter four-cylinder engine as the Chevy Cobalt, meaning you got either 149 or 175 horsepower. There was an SS version with a turbocharged 2-liter engine, but it was very rare. I barely seen one in the wild. Inside, the HHR had chunky plastic everywhere, an awkwardly high dashboard, and a high sitting position that make you feel like you were in a minivan, but without any of the practicality. It was a car that existed purely because GM thought they needed to check a box, and when sales predictably fizzled out, they quietly discontinued it in 2011. The Kia Spectra first generation, from 2000 to 2003. If there was ever a time for Kia to do something bold, it was in the early 2000s. Back then, Kia wasn't the semi-respectable brand we know today. They were a budget alternative, the brand you bought when you couldn't afford a Honda or Toyota. If they wanted to get noticed, they needed to take risks. Instead, they gave us the Kia Spectra. This first-generation Spectra launched in 2000 was so dull that even people who owned one might struggle to describe it. The design was as generic as it gets: soft, inoffensive lines, and forgettable front grille, proportion that suggested it was drawn up by someone who wasn't entirely awake. The handling was just as uninspiring, offering all the excitement of a grocery store shopping cart with a wobbly wheel. Inside, the Spectra followed the same "just make it work" philosophy. The material felt cheap, the seats were basic, and the design looked like it was inspired by a fax machine. It wasn't necessarily bad, it just had no personality whatsoever. Kia was still fighting an uphill battle for credibility at the time, and the Spectra didn't help. Before continuing the video, please take 3 seconds to click the subscribe button. I'm not even asking you for a like. Subscribing is enough effort. Thanks again. The Chevy Aveo, the first gen. If you're shopping for a car in the mid-2000s and walk into a Chevy dealership looking for something cheap, chances are the salesman will try to steer you towards the Chevrolet Aveo. The Aveo was actually a rebadged Daewoo, built to compete in the subcompact market against cars like the Toyota Yaris and Honda Fit. But while those cars offered personality and reliability, the Aveo offered, well, 4 wheels and a steering wheel. It was slow, cheaply built, and about as exciting as watching paint dry. The base engine was a 1.6-liter 4-cylinder, making 103 horsepower, which meant that highway merge felt like an Olympic event. The interior was a sea of hard plastics, and everything about screamed cost-cutting. Even the styling was bland. It looked like someone took a generic car shape and hit print. The Mitsubishi Galant 2004 to 2012. The Galant was like a zombie. It just kept going long after people stopped paying attention. This generation of Mitsubishi's mid-size sedan lasted 8 years with almost no changes, which is an eternity in this segment dominated by frequent redesigns. And yet, despite all the time on the market, it never established itself as a real alternative to the Camry, Accord, or Altima. Mitsubishi mainly sold the Galant to people with bad credit, and it showed. The interior was a masterclass in cost-cutting, with cheap plastics, dual styling, and seats that felt like they were stuffed with packing peanuts. Road noise was abundant, making long trips even more tedious. The Toyota Echo is what happens when a car company makes something so practical that it forgets to add any appeal. Toyota introduced the Echo in 2000 as a cheap, fuel-efficient option for buyers who needed transportation and nothing more. And that's exactly what they got. The design was awkward, with its tall, narrow stance making it look like a car that had been stretched vertically. Toyota pushed the wheels to the corners to maximize the interior space, but the end result was a stubby, dorky-looking sedan that nobody really wanted to be seen in. The interior wasn't much better, featuring a centrally mounted speedometer that made drivers feel like they were piloting an appliance rather than a car. Performance was just as uninspiring, with a 1.5-liter cylinder that made 108 horsepower, which was enough to move it, but not with any sense of urgency. Handling was floaty, and the Echo lightweight build meant that crosswinds on the highway could turn every drive into an adventure. Toyota sold the Echo primarily on reliability and efficiency, and while it delivered on those fronts, that wasn't enough to make it memorable. 2013 to 2018 Nissan Versa sedan. The brand had built a reputation for cheap cars with bad CVTs, and the Versa sedan was one of the cheapest new cars you could buy at that time. But instead of offering anything remotely desirable, Nissan gave us a bloated-looking blob on tiny wheels. The biggest selling point of the Versa was its affordability. It had a surprisingly large back seat for a low price, making it perfect for rental fleets. In fact, it was ideal for rental companies because it was so uninspiring that renters wouldn't feel the urge to drive recklessly. Performance, handling, and design all took a back seat to sheer cost-cutting, making it one of the most forgettable cars of this era. The Geo Metro. The car that made beige look like a bold life choice. If you ever wonder what it would feel like to drive a golf cart on the highway, this is it. Now, don't get me wrong, the Geo Metro had one thing going for it: fuel efficiency. This thing could sip gas like it was a fine wine, getting up to 50 miles per gallon in some models. That's impressive even by today's standards. But here's the thing: when the car's biggest selling point is that it doesn't use much gas, you know you're in for a snooze fest. The base Metro was powered by a 1-liter 3-cylinder engine that made 55 horsepower. Let me put that into perspective for you. A modern lawnmower could probably outpace this thing. And don't get me started on the interior. The seats felt like they were upholstered with recycled cardboard, and the dashboard looked like it was designed by someone who had only ever seen a car in a textbook. It didn't really try to be interesting. No quirks, no weird features, no attempt at style. It was the automotive equivalent of a plain rice cake. And yet, somehow it sold like crazy in the 90s. Why? Because it was cheap, very cheap, and reliable, and it didn't use much gas. So while the Geo Metro might have been a hero to your wallet, it was the villain to your soul. 2004 to 2005 Suzuki Forenza. Yes, this only lasted 2 years. And honestly, that's 2 years too many. Now here's where it gets interesting, or well, as interesting as the Forenza can get. This car was sold worldwide under different names. For example, in Canada it was called the Chevrolet Optra, because nothing say exciting like the word Optra. In other parts of the world it went by the name like Deu Lancetti and Holden Viva. But no matter what you call it, one thing remains the same. It was the bland. The design, it's like the designer were giving a blank sheet of paper and decided to play it so safe that they ended up with a car that looks like it was designed by a committee of people who hate fun. Under the hood, this thing didn't got better. The Forenza came with a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine that make 126 horsepower. That's not terrible, but it's not really exciting either. It's the kind of power that makes you think, well, at least it's moving. And the driving experience? Let's just say it was as about engaging as watching someone else play a video game. But here's the thing, the Suzuki Forenza wasn't bad. It was just there. It didn't break down, it didn't stand out, and it didn't leave any kind of impression. It was the automotive equivalent of participation trophy. You didn't win, but hey, at least you showed up. And a small fun fact about this car is that if you ever find yourself in Eastern Europe, you might just see one of these bad boys with a taxi sign on the top. That's right, that's one of the taxis' favorite in countries like Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and it makes sense. It's cheap, it's reliable, and it's so unremarkable that you'll forget you're even in a car. Next on the list, the Suzuki Verona. Now let's talk about the Suzuki Verona, a car that it's not just boring, but it's also a little bit sad. You see, the Verona wasn't really a Suzuki at all. It was a Deu Magnus in disguise. General Motors purchased Deu at that time, and they needed to dump the remaining stock somewhere. And Suzuki, being a good sport, they were like, sure, here we'll take it. Spoiler alert, this was the beginning of the end for Suzuki in North America. The Verona's design was, well, let's call it muted. It was the kind of a car that looked like it was designed by someone who had just given up on life. The exterior was bland, the interior was plasticky, and the whole thing screamed rental car special. But here's where it gets weird. The Verona had an optional 2.5-liter transverse inline 6-cylinder engine. That's very weird. Yes, you heard right. Inline 6 transversal. And it's front-wheel drives also. It wasn't quick, but it was smooth. But this didn't save the Verona. It was a snooze fest. The handling was numb, the steering felt like it was connected to the wheels via rubber band, and the whole driving experience was about as exciting as watching grass grow. 1996 to 2002 Toyota Camry. Alright, let's talk about this Camry, specifically this generation. The car is the undisputed king of boring, the emperor of uneventful, the sultan of snooze. But here's the thing, it's also one of the most reliable cars in the entire galaxy. And honestly, being boring is probably one of the main reasons why. The Camry didn't try to be flashy, it didn't try to be exciting, and it certainly didn't try to be different. It was designed to do one thing, and only one thing, to get you from point A to point B without any drama. And boy, did it deliver. The 2.2-liter four-cylinder engine was about as thrilling as a glass of warm milk, but it was bulletproof. There was even a V6 option. It was smooth, reliable, and completely devoid of personality. But here's the kicker. Compared to the other models I talked in this video, the Geo Metro, the Forenza, Verona, the Camry is the only one you will still see on the road from time to time. These cars won't die. They're like a cockroach. They will survive anything. In this video, I only chose models sold in the US during the last 30 years. If you had other cars that you think would have made this list but I forgot, please leave a comment down below. Subscribe, and if you have any other ideas of future videos, let me know as well. I'll try to read all the comments. See you in the next video.